For 2,000 years, the story of a carpenter's son from a forgotten province of the Roman Empire has shaped the rise and fall of kings, empires, and civilizations. His name, whispered in prayer, cried out in agony, and proclaimed in victory, has outlasted the voices of emperors and the edicts of tyrants. Across centuries, his teachings have brought both peace and bloodshed, unity and division. Yet within this towering figure's life, there exists a silence so profound, so curiously vacant, that even time itself seems hesitant to speak of it. Between the age of 12, when the boy, Jesus, is said to have spoken with the elders in the Temple of Jerusalem, and the age of 30, when he reappears on the banks of the Jordan River to be baptized by John, the written record falls utterly silent. 18 years, a span of time in which a child becomes a man. A voice finds its strength, a purpose is shaped, and a destiny chosen are absent. Not merely blurred, not vaguely referenced, but erased. For a man whose every word and action would come to shape the spiritual trajectory of billions, how could this absence be so complete? The Gospels, so careful in detailing the moments before and after, offer nothing. No travels, no teachings, no ordinary days spent in Nazareth streets. Nothing. It is as if, for nearly 2 decades, history itself held its breath. And yet, across the sands of time, faint echoes remain. In the monasteries of the East, in oral traditions passed between generations of mystics, and in forbidden texts consigned to the shadows by councils and kings, scattered fragments hint at a different tale. A story of a journey undertaken, of teachings received, and of truths encountered too dangerous for the world to hear. It is not the absence itself that unnerves the careful student of history. It is the precision of the silence. And in that silence, a question stirs, one that has waited for centuries to be asked aloud. If history, like nature, abhors a vacuum, then why has this one endured for nearly 2 millennia? How is it possible that no reliable record exists to account for these missing years in the life of a man whose teachings would ultimately reshape the known world? In an age where scribes documented the most trivial of imperial decrees, where names of obscure merchants and minor tax collectors have survived etched into stone and faded papyrus, how could nearly 2 decades of a life so consequential have simply vanished? Was it mere accident, the inevitable erosion of memory, by time's indifferent hand? Or was it something more deliberate? A carefully cultivated silence preserved not by chance, but by design. Could there have been events, discoveries, or teachings within those years so unsettling, so incompatible with the narratives later built in his name, that they had to be removed entirely from the world's collective memory? And if so, who decided what would remain and what must be forgotten? Who were the unseen hands that turned history's pages so carefully, excising entire chapters before sealing the book shut? Was it the early church, still fragile in its infancy, seeking to guard a fledgling faith from doctrines it could not control? Or the monastic orders that would later hoard ancient manuscripts behind monastery walls? Perhaps it was the church councils, those great assemblies of bishops and emperors, who declared which gospels were worthy of canonization, and which would be cast aside as heresy. Most unsettling of all is the possibility that records of these years still exist, hidden within forbidden archives, written in suppressed scrolls, preserved in crumbling monasteries far from the reach of modern eyes. And if they do, what truths might they contain? Could they speak of travels to distant lands, of teachings that blended ancient wisdom with radical new ideas, or of experiences so profound that they threatened the very foundation of doctrines built upon his name. These are the questions history has long been too afraid to ask, and tonight we ask them together. Because if those years truly existed, if Jesus of Nazareth did walk foreign lands, study ancient mysteries, sit at the feet of sages, or encounter truths unfit for later doctrine, then the history we have inherited is incomplete. And incomplete history is not merely a matter of academic curiosity, it is a weapon. For to control what people know of their past is to quietly dictate the shape of their future. If somewhere in those missing years lay teachings that challenged the monopoly of later church authority, insights into the nature of the soul, the afterlife, or the divine order that diverged from the sanctioned Gospels, what would it mean for the billions who have lived and died within those narrow bounds of belief? What if those 18 years contained wisdom drawn from ancient Egypt, the temples of India, the monasteries of the East, philosophies that saw no contradiction between man and nature, between the mortal and the eternal, wisdom that spoke of rebirth, the cycles of the soul, or the presence of divine spark in all people, not just those deemed righteous by clerical decree, and more troubling still, who chose to bury them. If these years were quietly erased not by the passing of time but by deliberate omission, then humanity was denied not just facts but possibilities. Possibilities for understanding itself, for approaching the divine on different terms, and for breaking free from narratives that serve power rather than truth. In denying us the full story, those unseen hands did more than conceal a biography. They shaped the boundaries of what generations would be allowed to question, to imagine, and to believe. And that is a theft far greater than any loss of parchment or ink. The official story, the one recited from pulpits, whispered in cathedrals, and inscribed upon stained glass, begins in a humble stable beneath a foreign sky. In the tiny town of Bethlehem, a child is born under mysterious circumstances. Angels appear to shepherds. Magi travel from the east, guided by a star no one else seems to have seen. A prophecy fulfilled, a Saviour born. In the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the earliest years of Jesus' life are described in only the briefest of terms. The infant is presented at the temple. The family flees to Egypt to escape Herod's wrath, and in time they return to settle in Nazareth. There, we're told, the boy grows in wisdom and stature, favored by both God and man. The next significant event occurs when Jesus reaches the age of 12. In a story recounted only by the Gospel of Luke, the boy is taken to Jerusalem for Passover. There he lingers in the temple, astonishing the elders with his understanding of Scripture. His parents, frantic after days of searching, find him among the learned men. He speaks, somewhat cryptically, of being about his father's business, and then silence. From the age of 12 to the age of 30, when Jesus reappears at the Jordan River to be baptized by John the Baptist, the canonical record offers nothing. The Gospels, so careful in their descriptions of his ministry, his miracles, his trials and crucifixion, pass over nearly 2 decades of his life without a single word. The public ministry that would follow, healings, sermons, parables, the gathering of disciples, the conflict with religious authorities, and his eventual death and resurrection, is narrated in exhaustive, sometimes overlapping detail across the 4 accepted texts. But of those formative years, when beliefs are shaped, knowledge is gathered, and the man becomes the messenger, nothing remains. No journeys, no teachings, no friendships, no conflicts, no words spoken, no stories told. It is a gap so vast that, in any other historical biography, it would be considered impossible to ignore. And yet, here it stands, an unspoken agreement between centuries of scribes and clerics to leave those pages conspicuously blank. In any biography, especially one so consequential, gaps are inevitable. Memories fade, records are lost, and the details of childhood and adolescence are often reduced to vague recollections. But what we find in the life of Jesus is not a simple oversight, nor a few scattered omissions. It is a silence so precise, so all-encompassing, that it feels less like the absence of record and more like the deliberate removal of one from the moment. Jesus astounds the elders in the temple at 12 years old. The curtain falls, and when it rises again 18 years later, he is a grown man, a carpenter by trade, a teacher by calling, and a figure already prepared to confront both religious and imperial authority. In those missing years, a boy would become a man. A man would refine his ideas about justice, divinity, and destiny. He would learn the customs of his people, absorb the wisdom of the world, perhaps travel beyond the narrow confines of Galilee and Judea, and yet we are told nothing. The unnatural nature of this gap becomes all the more evident when compared to other figures of religious or historical importance. The Hebrew Scriptures recount the early lives of patriarchs and prophets in meticulous detail. The life of Moses, the boyhood of Samuel, the formative years of King David, all are preserved not as trivial curiosities, but as essential insights into the nature of their later missions. Even lesser-known figures are given the dignity of a continuous narrative. So why would this one life, the life Christians hold as divine, the life whose every word would later be considered sacred, be left so barren of detail? Was it that nothing of importance happened, or that what did happen was considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too foreign to later orthodoxy to survive? The silence is conspicuous, for it arrives precisely where the narrative ought to matter most. It is not the result of lost scrolls or crumbled papyrus, but of a careful tradition that preserved every sermon, every miracle, every betrayal, yet forgot to record the years when a carpenter's son might have encountered the very ideas that made him a threat to empires and doctrines alike. When omissions occur in ancient texts, historians usually look for practical explanations: wars, fires, lost manuscripts, or the natural decay of fragile scrolls. Gaps in history are rarely treated as sinister in themselves. But in this case, in the life of Jesus, the absence of detail isn't merely suspicious because it exists, but because of when, where, and how it manifests. This is not the loss of obscure regional records or minor personal details. It is the vanishing of nearly 2 decades in the life of the central figure of one of history's most influential faiths, and it happens in a tradition that was otherwise painstaking in its preservation. The early church was obsessive in recording the sayings, actions, and miracles of Jesus. His birth was chronicled in layered symbolism. His final week before the crucifixion was documented in such overlapping detail that it fills a quarter of the gospel narratives. Yet, the years in which a boy becomes a man unlikely forms the very philosophies that would one day place him at odds with both the Sanhedrin and Rome are missing without explanation. The peculiarity deepens when one considers the Church's later zeal for suppressing heterodox writings. Throughout history, any text or teaching that conflicted with official doctrine was swiftly labeled heretical, banned, and often destroyed. The Vatican maintained strict control over what stories of Jesus would be permitted, what interpretations sanctioned, and what competing narratives buried. It would be naive to assume this same institution, so ruthless in its later centuries, but have simply overlooked the most formative period in its founder's life. More disturbingly, there are scattered accounts, fragments from early Christian sects, writings from mystics, and oral traditions from lands far from Judea that suggest those lost years were not entirely empty. They hint at travels, secret teachings, and encounters with philosophies the later church would have found dangerously subversive. In such a climate, it becomes increasingly difficult to view the silence of the Gospels as an accident of history. It feels more like a page torn deliberately from a book, leaving just enough behind to disguise that anything is missing at all. Long before the Vatican rose to become an untouchable seat of power in medieval Europe, it was a fragile and cautious institution, one that recognized early the inescapable link between memory and authority. In those early centuries after the death of Jesus, countless stories circulated about his life and teachings. Some came from apostles, others from devoted followers, and still others from those who claimed to have encountered him in visions or dreams. These accounts, written in varying languages and dialects, told not one story but many. Some were mystical, others practical. Some spoke of miracles, while others recounted cryptic lessons whispered on remote hillsides. In those chaotic first centuries of Christianity, no central authority existed to declare one version of events correct. Communities in Syria, Egypt, Greece, and Rome preserved their own accounts, often emphasizing radically different aspects of Jesus' character and mission. Some believed he was fully divine, others argued he was entirely human. Some described him as a bringer of peace, others as a revolutionary figure sent to upend worldly hierarchies. The earliest leaders of what would become the Church understood that these competing narratives posed a threat. Without a single, unified version of Jesus' life and teachings, the fledgling faith could fracture beyond repair. And so, in the shadows of persecution and the ruins of a crumbling empire, the custodians of memory set about a daunting task: to collect, select, and sanctify those texts that aligned with the vision of faith they wished to preserve, and to silence the rest. By the early 4th century, under the rule of Emperor Constantine, Christianity was no longer a persecuted sect, but an officially sanctioned religion. The Church quickly seized this moment of newfound legitimacy to consolidate its control over sacred memory. Certain Gospels were copied and shared. Others were denounced as heresy. Dozens of texts, including those that may have spoken of Jesus' lost years, were deemed dangerous, not necessarily because they were false, but because they offered versions of truth inconvenient to the hierarchy being formed by declaring these texts apocryphal. The early Church didn't merely ban books, it banned entire versions of history. It confiscated manuscripts, destroyed scrolls, and anathematized those who preserved forbidden accounts. Over time, the surviving Gospels became the ones that told a carefully curated story, one that left no room for troubling gaps or alternative voices, and thus, through quiet erasure rather than open debate, the Vatican took hold of the past, ensuring that only the memory it approved would survive into the future. If the early Church subtly gathered control over sacred texts in private, it was through the great Church councils that this authority was publicly cemented. Convened under imperial favor and religious necessity, these assemblies were not gentle gatherings of philosophers debating the nature of the divine. They were, in many cases, fiercely political, shaped by power struggles as much as theology. and through them, decisions were made that would determine not only what Christians believed, but what they would never be allowed to believe again. The most famous of these was the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, called by Emperor Constantine, who recognized the need for a unified doctrine to stabilize his empire. This gathering set the precedent. Bishops from across the Christian world were summoned to settle disputes over Jesus' divine nature, the correct dating of Easter, and crucially, which scriptures should be recognized as authoritative. In this moment, competing gospels and oral traditions began to disappear from history. It was not that these councils invented Christian doctrine, but rather that they selected from a diverse, often contradictory body of texts and teachings. Gospels deemed useful to the emerging orthodoxy were canonized. Others were denounced as heretical, their followers excommunicated, their writings ordered destroyed. Entire branches of early Christianity, some of which may have preserved records of Jesus' lost years, were snuffed out, their memory reduced to the bitter insults written by their victors. Over the centuries, other councils followed: Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, and dozens more regional synods. Each one acted as both judge and executioner of history. They debated not only the nature of the divine, but also which voices should be remembered and which consigned to oblivion. The result was a tightening control over memory itself. What remained was a narrative acceptable to both spiritual and imperial authority, one that reinforced obedience, submission to ecclesiastical hierarchy, and a carefully controlled image of Christ. What was omitted were the inconvenient complexities, the lost teachings, the alternative traditions, the years unaccounted for. Through these councils, history was not only written, it was officially approved. As the Church's authority deepened through the centuries, so too did its appetite for information and its instinct to conceal it. Out of this impulse grew one of the most enigmatic and heavily guarded institutions in human history, the Vatican's secret archives. To outsiders, it has always sounded like something from legend, a vault of forbidden knowledge and lost manuscripts. Yet it is no legend. It exists, and it has existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years. The origins of the archives can be traced to the earliest days of papal power, when the Church, like any institution seeking to endure, began preserving documents of importance. Initially, these included papal decrees, imperial edicts, and legal disputes. But as the centuries passed, the nature of what was preserved and hidden changed. By the medieval period, the archives had evolved into something far more significant than a mere collection of records. They became a treasury of knowledge, housing not only administrative documents but also ancient texts, theological works, letters from kings, the minutes of church councils, and perhaps most intriguingly, books and writings declared heretical. In an age when ideas could be as dangerous as armies, the Vatican understood that to control knowledge was to control belief, and to control belief was to govern hearts, minds, and entire empires. The archives swelled with acquisitions from across Europe and beyond, manuscripts confiscated during inquisitions, texts seized from fallen cities, and documents inherited from Rome's imperial libraries all found their way behind the thick walls of the Vatican. It was not always a matter of destruction. The Church, in many cases, did not burn forbidden books, it kept them. And in keeping them, it ensured that knowledge stayed buried, accessible only to those trusted to guard it. Today, the Vatican's secret archives are said to stretch over 50 kilometers of shelving, a labyrinth of history hidden from the world. Access remains highly restricted. Only a handful of scholars are granted permission each year, and even they are allowed to view only carefully selected documents under strict supervision and for limited hours. No copies may leave, no photographs permitted. Rumors persist of what lies within. Early Christian Gospels, long thought lost, records of the Church's dealings with emperors and heretics, letters from ancient sages, and perhaps even manuscripts, chronicling those silent years of Jesus' life. If such records exist, they have remained sealed, not lost, preserved in perfect darkness, and in that darkness, the boundaries of history have been drawn not by what is known, but by what has been deliberately withheld. In the long history of controlling knowledge, few tools were as effective and as feared as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, established formally in 1559 under Pope Paul IV. It was a list of writings deemed heretical, scandalous, or dangerous to the faith and morals of Catholics. But the roots of this censorship run much deeper, reflecting a centuries-old desire to guard the boundaries of belief by controlling the very words people could read. The index wasn't merely a blacklist, it was a weapon of memory control. Books that questioned church doctrines, explored alternative spiritualities, or revealed inconvenient truths about Jesus' life were condemned. Authors were silenced, their works burned or hidden away in secret vaults. Possession of forbidden texts could lead to persecution, imprisonment, or worse. Among those condemned were many early Christian writings that offered differing perspectives on Jesus' teachings and life texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and others that hinted at the lost years, secret knowledge, and alternative histories erased from the official narrative. The Church's commitment to maintaining this list for over 4 centuries demonstrates the lengths to which it would go to protect a singular version of history. Even after the index was officially abolished in 1966, the legacy of suppression lingers. Many works remain difficult to access, and stories that challenge orthodox teachings are still met with resistance. The Index of Forbidden Books was more than censorship. It was a strategic effort to shape collective memory, ensuring that what was allowed to be read reinforced the version of Jesus' life and mission that the Church wished the world to know, leaving little room for the lost years to ever resurface. In the shadowed halls of Europe's monasteries, monks became more than devout servants of faith. They became the guardians of history itself. Tasked with preserving sacred knowledge, these monastic orders meticulously copied, catalogued, and safeguarded manuscripts that might otherwise have vanished into the dark abyss of time. The Benedictines, perhaps the most famous of these orders, established scriptoria, dedicated writing rooms, where painstaking labor turned fragile parchments into enduring legacies. Every letter was carefully penned, every word weighed as monks replicated the Bible, early Christian texts, and sometimes even works of classical philosophy and science. Yet this was no neutral act of preservation. These monastic scribes decided which texts were worthy of copying and which were to be ignored or destroyed. Their choices reflected the Church's growing control over what knowledge would survive. Texts that deviated from accepted doctrine, or that hinted at forbidden truths, such as alternative accounts of Jesus' life, were often left to fade. This custodianship was a double-edged sword. On one hand, without these monks, much of the ancient world's knowledge might have been lost entirely. On the other, their gatekeeping meant that the history handed down to future generations was filtered, curated, and in many cases, deliberately incomplete. Monastic orders were the church's living archives, wielding quiet power through the preservation and omission of texts. In their hands lay the fragile thread that connected the past to the present, and the ability to weave a narrative that aligned with the church's vision, keeping the lost years of Jesus locked away in silence. While the Gospels remained silent on nearly 2 decades of Jesus' life, the wider world was anything but isolated. During this same era, vast networks of trade and culture flourished, connecting distant civilizations through the arteries of commerce and exchange. Among these, the Silk Road stands as the most remarkable, a sprawling web of caravan routes, stretching thousands of miles from the Mediterranean shores to the heart of East Asia. Far from being a mere path for merchants, the Silk Road was a conduit for ideas, religions, and philosophies. Goods like silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic animals were traded, but alongside them traveled stories, beliefs, and knowledge. Buddhist monks, Zoroastrian priests, Greek philosophers, and Persian sages all moved along these routes, bringing with them new ways of thinking and worship. The significance of the Silk Road in antiquity cannot be overstated. It was a world alive with cultural cross-pollination, where Greek science met Indian mathematics and Egyptian mysteries mingled with Chinese inventions. Cities like Palmyra, Petra, and Samarkand became bustling centers where East and West intertwined. Within this dynamic context, travel was not only possible but common for those seeking wisdom, trade, or refuge. For a young man like Jesus, living under Roman occupation, such routes offered a gateway to a world of spiritual and philosophical diversity far beyond Judea's borders. It is here, along these routes, that some scholars speculate the lost years might have unfolded, a time when Jesus could have encountered Eastern traditions, studied under foreign teachers, or absorbed ideas that later influenced his ministry. The Silk Road was a bridge across continents and cultures, challenging the notion that Jesus' life was confined to a small corner of the ancient world. Understanding the vastness and vibrancy of these trade networks invites us to reconsider the possibility that those silent years were not lost to oblivion, but hidden within a world that was richly connected and alive with exchange. Long before the age of modern transport, travel was an integral part of life for many in the ancient world. Far from being isolated communities, civilizations like India, Egypt, and Greece were connected through a rich tapestry of trade, pilgrimage, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange. Journeys spanning hundreds, even thousands of miles were undertaken by merchants, scholars, mystics, and seekers of knowledge. In India, pilgrims traveled vast distances to sacred sites, while scholars ventured to centers of learning like Taxila and Nalanda. The exchange of ideas was vibrant, with Buddhism and Hindu philosophies spreading well beyond the subcontinent's borders. Monks journeyed along rugged mountain passes and river valleys, sharing teachings and scriptures with distant communities. Egypt, with its ancient temples and bustling Nile cities, was a crossroads between Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Greeks, Romans, and traders from Asia mingled in Alexandria, a city famed for its great library and cosmopolitan culture. Greek philosophers and Egyptian priests exchanged knowledge on astronomy, medicine, and the mysteries of life and death. The Mediterranean Sea itself was a highway, linking ports from Athens to Carthage, enabling not only commerce but also cultural diffusion. Greece was no stranger to travel, with its city-states sending envoys, artists, and scholars across the ancient world. The spread of Hellenistic culture following Alexander the Great's conquests created a vast network that stretched from Greece to Egypt and into the Indian subcontinent. This unprecedented fusion of East and West fostered an era where ideas and beliefs flowed freely along with goods. These interconnected cultures demonstrated that travel was not only possible, but also encouraged, especially among those seeking spiritual growth or wisdom. Roads, rivers, and seas formed the veins through which knowledge and experience circulated. For a figure like Jesus, whose teachings show traces of diverse influences, such a context suggests that journeys beyond Judea could have been both feasible and formative. The early travel culture of these civilizations challenges any notion that ancient peoples were static or isolated. Instead, it reveals a vibrant world where ideas moved as freely as goods, a world in which the lost years of Jesus might have been lived and learned far from the dusty hills of Galilee. While the canonical Gospels remain silent on Jesus' missing years, records from other religious traditions hint at parallel figures whose lives intersect with similar mysteries and teachings. Across Asia and the Mediterranean, spiritual leaders emerged who, like Jesus, inspired devotion, sparked controversy, and whose biographies sometimes share puzzling gaps or unexplained journeys. In India, for example, legends speak of Yus Asaf, a mysterious sage said to have traveled from the West and taught principles closely resembling those of Jesus. Some local traditions even claim he lived well beyond the typical lifespan, preaching a message of compassion and enlightenment. These stories, passed down through oral traditions and sparse manuscripts, suggest a figure strikingly akin to the Nazarene. Meanwhile, in Egypt, mystics and priests practiced ancient wisdom that echoes themes found in early Christian mysticism. Hermetic texts, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, offered teachings on the divine nature of humanity and the cosmos, ideas that would later intertwine with Christian thought. These records indicate a spiritual milieu rich with exchange and synthesis. Further east, Buddhist and Jain traditions describe teachers whose lives, like Jesus, included periods of wandering, intense study, and transformative revelation. Their stories often emphasize journeys into the wilderness and encounters with other religious traditions, suggesting a shared human quest for meaning transcending borders. These records, scattered and often fragmentary, open the possibility that Jesus' lost years were not lived in isolation, but were part of a wider tapestry of spiritual exploration. They hint at a world where teachings crossed boundaries, and religious figures walked paths that sometimes converged, influencing one another in ways official history has yet to fully acknowledge. To modernize, the idea of a young Jewish man traveling thousands of miles across continents might seem unlikely, even implausible. Yet, when we examine the historical and cultural realities of the time, it becomes clear that travel was not only possible but relatively common, especially for those with spiritual or intellectual pursuits. Roman roads, for example, created an extensive network that connected Judea with the broader empire. These well-maintained highways allowed merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and philosophers to journey with greater speed and safety than previously imagined. Sea routes along the Mediterranean further opened access to distant lands like Egypt, Greece, and beyond. Moreover, Jesus came from a society where pilgrimage was a regular part of religious life. Jewish festivals drew thousands to Jerusalem each year, and many would take the opportunity to meet travelers or seek new teachers. The cultural context of the time valued knowledge, spiritual insight, and the pursuit of wisdom, motivations that could inspire long journeys. Historical records also reveal groups of itinerant teachers and ascetics who traveled widely, sharing their teachings and learning from other traditions. The Essenes, for example, known for their strict communal life and spiritual discipline, had connections across regions, taught travel itself, while challenging, was facilitated by inns, caravans, and the infrastructure supporting trade routes. Though not a luxury trip, it was a feasible endeavor for those committed to exploration or pilgrimage. Understanding these realities invites us to reconsider the rigid boundaries often placed on Jesus' early life. The possibility that he journeyed to distant lands is not a wild fantasy but a credible hypothesis, grounded in the social and historical fabric of the ancient world. Among the most compelling and enigmatic theories about Jesus' lost years is the legend of Isa, also known as Uz Asaf, a mysterious figure revered in parts of India and Pakistan, whose story echoes that of the Nazarene in startling ways. According to local tradition, Isa was a holy man who traveled to the Indian subcontinent, spreading teachings of love, compassion, and monotheism. The name Isa itself is the Arabic and Persian form of Jesus, linking this figure directly to the Christian Messiah. The legend holds that Isa Uz Asaf arrived in Kashmir, nestled in the Himalayas, where he lived, taught, and eventually died. His tomb, known as the Rosabelle Shrine in Srinagar, has been a site of pilgrimage for centuries, drawing curious travelers and devout seekers alike. Some who have visited the site report that the tomb's inscriptions and architecture are inconsistent with local traditions, suggesting an unusual origin. This theory challenges the canonical narrative that Jesus' life ended in crucifixion and resurrection in Jerusalem. Instead, proponents suggest that Jesus survived the crucifixion, or that the crucifixion story was misunderstood or symbolic, and journeyed eastward, seeking refuge and spiritual growth in India. The harsh terrain of the Himalayas and the region's ancient spiritual heritage provided an ideal backdrop for a man pursuing enlightenment and teaching a message that bridged East and West. Intriguingly, historical Muslim scholars like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in the 19th century revived and popularized this theory, interpreting Islamic texts and local folklore to support the idea that Jesus escaped death and traveled to India. Ahmad's writings sparked interest but also controversy, challenging established Christian and Islamic views, while mainstream historians and theologians often dismiss the Isa Uz Asaf legend as myth or folklore. The enduring presence of this narrative in Kashmir and beyond raises profound questions about the completeness of the biblical account. Could the lost years of Jesus be hidden not in Europe or Judea, but among the mountains and monasteries of the Himalayas? This possibility invites a reconsideration of the boundaries between history, faith, and legend. Beyond the intriguing Isa Uz Asaf legend, the lost years of Jesus also find echoes in the rich oral traditions of Buddhism and Hinduism, ancient spiritual frameworks deeply rooted in the Indian subcontinent. These traditions, passed down for generations through storytelling, ritual, and song, contain fascinating parallels and veiled references that some scholars believe may hint at an interaction between Jesus and Eastern philosophies during his formative years. In Buddhist folklore, there are tales of wandering sages and enlightened teachers who traveled extensively, crossing borders and sharing wisdom. Some oral accounts speak of a foreign righteous man whose teachings mirrored core Buddhist principles: compassion, humility, and detachment from worldly desires. Though never named directly, these descriptions bear striking resemblance to the character and message of Jesus as depicted in Christian texts. Similarly, Hindu traditions recount stories of holy men who journeyed beyond their native lands, seeking enlightenment and spreading spiritual truths that transcended sectarian boundaries. Concepts such as ahimsa, nonviolence, universal love, and the pursuit of self-realization resonate deeply with the ethical teachings attributed to Jesus. Certain sects within Hinduism, particularly those influenced by bhakti movements, emphasizing devotion and personal relationship with the divine, emphasize stories of saints and teachers who bridged cultural divides. Some oral narratives speak of a guru from the West whose presence brought a fresh perspective on divine love and salvation, ideas that harmonize intriguingly with Christian theology. These oral traditions, while often dismissed as myth or folklore by mainstream scholarship, serve as cultural memory banks, preserving fragments of encounters between diverse spiritual worlds. They suggest that Jesus' missing years could have included journeys where he engaged with Buddhist monks in the monasteries of the Himalayas, or studied under Hindu sages in remote ashrams. Such interactions would not be unprecedented. The ancient world was far more interconnected than commonly assumed, with spiritual seekers routinely crossing vast distances. These traditions encourage us to look beyond the conventional boundaries of history and consider that Jesus' spiritual formation may have been deeply influenced by Eastern wisdom that shaped the compassion and teachings he later brought back to Judea. Beyond legends and oral traditions, some historical whispers about Jesus' lost years come from monastic scrolls discovered in remote corners of the Indian subcontinent and the broader Himalayan region. These ancient manuscripts, preserved in monasteries and temples, contain enigmatic references to a Western holy man whose teachings resonated with local spiritual traditions and whose journey seemed to bridge worlds. Among the most notable are scrolls attributed to Buddhist and Kashmiri monastic communities, which mention a figure called Isa or use Asaph, believed by some scholars to be another name for Jesus. These texts describe a teacher who arrived from the West, preaching a message of compassion, forgiveness, and the unity of all faiths, themes familiar to Christian doctrine, yet expressed in the philosophical language of the East. One such scroll, housed in a small monastery high in the Himalayas, reportedly recounts the arrival of this wandering teacher during a time of great spiritual awakening. It describes how Isa was welcomed by monks and scholars, who were struck by his profound wisdom and humility. The scrolls detail dialogues between Isa and Buddhist monks, touching on subjects such as the nature of suffering, the path to salvation, and the importance of inner transformation. Though access to these scrolls has been severely limited, and their authenticity debated, the consistency of such references across various isolated manuscripts is striking. Some researchers argue that these texts reflect a shared spiritual heritage, where the teachings of Jesus found common ground with Eastern philosophies. Moreover, Kashmiri historical records describe the establishment of a shrine at the Rosabal site in Srinagar, which locals claim houses the remains of this Western holy man. The scrolls often associate Isa, use Asaph with this location, suggesting his presence in the region was both significant and enduring. Whether these monastic scrolls are literal historical accounts or allegorical narratives, their existence challenges the accepted boundaries of Jesus' life story. They hint at a chapter erased from mainstream history, a time when East and West converged through a figure who transcended cultural and religious divides. Alexandria, the fabled city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, was more than just a bustling port. It was an epicenter of ancient knowledge and spiritual exploration. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Alexandria quickly became a melting pot of cultures, philosophies, and religions. Its famed Great Library attracted scholars, mystics, and philosophers from across the ancient world, creating a unique environment where ideas flourished and traditions intertwined. In the context of Jesus' lost years, Alexandria's significance lies in its role as a crossroads of intellectual and spiritual currents. This city was home to a vibrant community of Jewish scholars, familiar with Hellenistic philosophy and deeply engaged with Egyptian wisdom traditions. The fusion of these diverse perspectives created fertile ground for mystical teachings and esoteric knowledge. Alexandria also nurtured early Christian thought, long before Christianity became institutionalized. It was here that influential theologians like Origen and Clement of Alexandria sought to reconcile Christian doctrine with Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism. This blending of ideas influenced the development of early Christian mysticism and theological debates that would shape the religion's trajectory. Moreover, Alexandria was closely linked to the Hermetic tradition, an ancient spiritual system attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, whose writings explored the nature of the divine, the cosmos, and the human soul. Hermeticism emphasized secret knowledge, spiritual transformation, and the pursuit of enlightenment, concepts that resonate deeply with the mystical aspects of Jesus' teachings. The city's syncretic environment also hosted mystery schools, where initiates were guided through symbolic rituals designed to reveal hidden truths about life and the universe. It is within this atmosphere of intellectual openness and spiritual experimentation that some theories suggest Jesus may have spent time during his missing years studying and engaging with these mystical currents. Alexandria's legacy as a beacon of ancient wisdom invites us to consider that Jesus' early life might have been shaped not only by the traditions of Judea, but also by the rich philosophical and mystical heritage of Egypt. This possibility widens the lens through which we view his spiritual development and the origins of his teachings. In the vibrant spiritual landscape of the ancient Mediterranean, the schools of Pythagoras and the Hermetic traditions stood out as powerful centers of esoteric knowledge and philosophical inquiry. Both influenced the intellectual climate of Alexandria and surrounding regions, fostering teachings that explored the divine order, the soul's immortality, and the mysteries of the cosmos, ideas that some scholars believe intersected with the hidden years of Jesus. The Pythagorean school, founded by the Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE, was more than a hub for mathematics and geometry. It was a spiritual community that saw numbers and mathematical relationships as keys to understanding the universe's divine harmony. Pythagoreans practiced strict ethical codes, communal living, and mysticism, emphasizing purification of the soul and the pursuit of enlightenment, concepts echoing in the moral teachings attributed to Jesus. Hermeticism, attributed to the mythical figure Hermes Trismegistus, was a complex spiritual tradition blending Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish thought. The Hermetic texts, such as the Corpus Hermeticum, discussed the nature of God, the mind, and the cosmos, promoting the idea that humans could ascend spiritually through knowledge and inner transformation. This tradition's focus on secret wisdom and the symbolic interpretation of Scripture parallels some of the allegorical teachings found in Christian Gospels. Both Pythagorean and Hermetic schools were known for their secrecy, with knowledge passed down only to initiates deemed worthy. This exclusivity aligns with theories that Jesus might have been initiated into these mystery traditions, gaining access to profound spiritual insights during his so-called lost years. Such an education could explain the depth of his parables, his emphasis on inner purity, and his revolutionary approach to religious authority. Importantly, Alexandria was a rare place where these diverse traditions, Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, Jewish thought, this melting pot of spiritual ideas may have provided the perfect environment for a young Jesus to study, question, and develop his teachings away from the strictures of his homeland. The echoes of Pythagorean harmony and Hermetic mysticism in early Christian thought suggest that Jesus' lost years were not wasted or empty, but filled with transformative learning that shaped the foundation of his later ministry. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, offer only glimpses of Jesus' early life, leaving a notable void in his so-called lost years. Yet, beyond these accepted texts, a collection of apocryphal or lost Gospels hint at a more complex narrative, some of which suggest Egypt as a significant backdrop for parts of Jesus' formative journey. These lost Gospel texts, excluded from the official New Testament canon, were often circulated among early Christian sects with alternative theological perspectives. Several of these writings reference Egypt not only as a geographical location, but as a spiritual center of hidden knowledge and mysticism, reinforcing the idea that Jesus' path intersected with the ancient wisdom preserved there. For instance, the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, contains cryptic and mystical teachings that differ sharply from the canonical narratives. Some scholars argue that its origins are linked to Egyptian Christian communities familiar with Hermetic and Gnostic traditions, both of which flourished in Egypt. The text emphasizes inner enlightenment and secret knowledge hallmarks of Egyptian mystery schools. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, another non-canonical text, also bears traces of Egyptian spiritual influence. Mary Magdalene is portrayed as a key disciple who understands esoteric teachings, possibly reflecting the Egyptian reverence for feminine divine wisdom. This gospel hints at a more mystical and less dogmatic understanding of Jesus' message, one that may have been cultivated in Egypt's syncretic religious environment. Further, the Acts of Pilate and other apocryphal acts place Jesus or his followers in Egypt, suggesting that the region served as a refuge or center of spiritual activity. During his early or lost years, these texts often blend historical elements with symbolic layers, pointing to a broader tradition of Jesus' teachings influenced by Egyptian mystery religions. The suppression of these Gospels by early church authorities, most notably through measures such as the Index of Forbidden Books, has contributed to their marginalization. Yet, their existence continues to fuel theories that Egypt held profound significance in Jesus' life, possibly as a place where he absorbed mystical teachings and prepared for his public ministry. Among the most intriguing leads in the search for Jesus' lost years are the teachings and lifestyle of the Essenes, a Jewish sect that thrived in Judea roughly between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. This enigmatic group, largely forgotten until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century, lived in communal isolation near the Dead Sea, devoted to strict religious observance, ritual purity, and apocalyptic expectations. The parallels between Essene philosophy and Jesus' teachings suggest a connection that may shed light on his formative years. The Essenes were known for their ascetic lifestyle, practicing celibacy or strict family life, communal ownership of property, and rigorous daily rituals aimed at spiritual cleansing. Their worldview emphasized the imminent arrival of the teacher of righteousness, a messianic figure who would bring divine justice and restore Israel. Many scholars see resonances between this expectation and Jesus' own messianic mission. Philosophically, the Essenes stressed purity of heart and spirit, compassion, nonviolence, and communal harmony, values echoed in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his parables. Their rejection of the corruption of the Jerusalem temple priesthood and skepticism of Roman rule also mirrored Jesus' critiques of religious and political authorities. The Essenes' deep engagement with Scripture and their production of extensive writings reveal a sophisticated theological framework. Their emphasis on prophetic visions, angelology, and dualistic struggles between forces of light and darkness aligns with some elements in the New Testament, particularly in the apocalyptic imagery of the Book of Revelation. Importantly, the Essenes maintains schools or training communities where spiritual instruction, meditation, and ritual practice prepared initiates for a higher level of divine understanding. This raises the possibility that Jesus may have spent part of his early years within or influenced by such a community, receiving teachings that shaped his approach to spirituality and social reform. While the New Testament does not explicitly mention the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls unearthed near Qumran have opened a window into this hidden world, offering texts that parallel or expand on ideas found in Christian scripture. The scrolls' rediscovery has prompted scholars to re-examine Jesus' background, proposing that his philosophy was not developed in isolation, but within a broader Jewish milieu that included the Essenes. Thus, the parallels between Essene philosophy and Jesus' teachings invite us to consider that his lost years might have been spent in the study and practice of this ascetic, mystical tradition, a hidden chapter, erased or obscured by later Orthodox narratives. The idea that Jesus may have apprenticed with the Essenes during his lost years has long intrigued historians, theologians, and seekers of hidden truths. This theory suggests that rather than wandering aimlessly or remaining in obscurity, Jesus was actively engaged in rigorous spiritual training within a secretive and disciplined community that deeply influenced his worldview and teachings. The Essenes, as custodians of esoteric knowledge and strict moral codes, would have provided an ideal environment for a young Jesus seeking spiritual depth. Their communities were not mere hermitages, but vibrant centers of learning, prayer, and scriptural study. It's plausible that Jesus, coming of age in Judea, found in the Essenes a refuge from mainstream society's corruption and a place to explore profound theological and mystical questions. Apprenticeship, in this context, would have included immersion in ritual purity, practices, daily baths, fasting, and observance of the Sabbath, designed to purify body and soul. Jesus' own emphasis on inner purity and spiritual rebirth in later teachings echoes these Essene disciplines. Furthermore, the Essenes' commitment to communal living and detachment from materialism might have influenced Jesus' later rejection of worldly wealth and status. Scholars also point to the similarities between the teachings attributed to John the Baptist, often linked with Essene practices, and Jesus' own baptism and message of repentance. Some propose that Jesus' baptism was not merely symbolic, but part of his initiation into Essene spirituality. The proximity of John's ministry to Essene communities near the Jordan River, lends further credibility to this connection. Beyond ritual and doctrine, the Essenes were known for their mystical outlook, including beliefs in angels, cosmic dualism, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. These themes permeate the New Testament, especially in apocalyptic texts, suggesting that Jesus' exposure to Essene theology deeply shaped his eschatological vision. Yet, the New Testament remains silent or vague about any direct association between Jesus and the Essenes, possibly because later church authorities found this connection inconvenient or threatening to orthodox narratives. Acknowledging Jesus as a student of a sect outside official Judaism might have complicated his portrayal as a unique messianic figure. While no definitive historical proof confirms Jesus' apprenticeship among the Essenes, the convergence of philosophical, ritualistic, and theological parallels invites serious consideration. His lost years may have been a period of intense spiritual preparation, study, and initiation, hidden chapters in a story carefully edited or erased from mainstream history. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1947 and the 1950s near Qumran was a watershed moment in biblical archaeology and religious history. These ancient manuscripts, dating from roughly 150 BCE to 70 CE, unveiled a rich trove of texts written by the Essenes and related Jewish groups. The scrolls revealed complex religious beliefs, apocalyptic expectations, and a way of life remarkably parallel to themes found in the New Testament. For those exploring Jesus' lost years, the scrolls offer tantalizing clues that challenge conventional narratives. Among the scrolls are biblical texts, predating previously known manuscripts by centuries, showing the fluidity and diversity of Jewish religious thought before Christianity fully emerged. Many scrolls contain esoteric writings on angelic hierarchies, cosmic battles between forces of light and darkness, and laws governing purity and community. These elements resonate strongly with the theological framework Jesus later articulated. Crucially, the scrolls introduce the figure of the teacher of righteousness, a messianic leader who upheld true knowledge and opposed the corrupt priesthood. Scholars debate whether Jesus consciously aligned with or distanced himself from this figure's legacy, but the parallels suggest a shared cultural and spiritual milieu. The emphasis on preparing for an imminent divine intervention mirrors Jesus' own apocalyptic preaching. Moreover, the scrolls provide insight into the Essenes' stringent community rules that may have influenced Jesus' emphasis on moral discipline, charity, and eschewing material excess. The detailed legal texts echo some of Jesus' teachings about the law's spirit versus its letter, hinting that his ethical vision was rooted in a broader tradition of Jewish reform and renewal. The scrolls also reference the sons of light and sons of darkness, dualistic forces locked in eternal struggle, an idea vividly reflected in New Testament apocalyptic literature. This cosmic battle motif underpins much of Jesus' message about the kingdom of God, judgment, and salvation. However, the scrolls contain no explicit mention of Jesus himself, fueling speculation that the sect that produced them either predated his ministry or deliberately excluded him. This absence raises provocative questions about the interplay between Essene communities and the nascent Christian movement. The Vatican's cautious approach to the scrolls, marked by limited early access and slow publication of findings, has contributed to suspicions about what truths might still be concealed. Some theorists argue that the scrolls hint at knowledge or texts about Jesus' early life and spiritual development that were suppressed or lost. In some, the Dead Sea Scrolls open a window onto a Jewish world brimming with spiritual ferment, communal rigor, and eschatological hope. They enrich our understanding of Jesus, possible influences during his lost years and invite us to reconsider what official history has chosen to omit or obscure. Tucked away beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City lies one of the most enigmatic and heavily guarded repositories of human history, the Vatican's secret archives. Far from the imagination of casual tourists, the archives are a labyrinthine fortress of knowledge and secrecy, home to millions of documents spanning over 12 centuries. This immense archive holds the whispered echoes of history's deepest mysteries, including those tantalizing gaps and erased chapters such as the lost years of Jesus. Physically, the Vatican's secret archives are a sprawling complex of subterranean corridors, reading rooms, and vaults. The precise size is a closely held secret, but estimates suggest it stretches for nearly 85 kilometers over 50 miles of shelving, housing some 35,000 volumes. The archive is meticulously climate-controlled, maintained at stable temperature and humidity to preserve ancient parchments, papyri, and manuscripts that range from fragile medieval scrolls to Renaissance codices. Access to the archives is strictly regulated by the Vatican itself, overseen by a prefect appointed by the Pope. The entry point, a nondescript door nestled in the Apostolic Palace, leads visitors down a series of security checkpoints equipped with modern surveillance, metal detectors, and biometric controls. Every visitor is subjected to rigorous background checks, and only qualified scholars with explicit permission can enter, usually for a limited duration and with tight constraints on what they may study. Inside, the corridors are lined with towering wooden shelves arranged in a seemingly endless maze of rows and rooms. Each shelf bears handwritten catalogue numbers in Latin, meticulously cross-referenced with fragile index cards and digital databases. Despite modernization efforts, the archives retain much of their ancient character. Dim lighting, worn stone floors, and heavy oak doors with iron locks evoke an atmosphere that is both scholarly and secretive. Among the treasures stored within are papal bulls, correspondence between monarchs and the papacy, records of church councils, theological treatises, and documents on diplomatic relations that shaped European and global history. Yet it is what is not publicly catalogued that fuels endless speculation. The rumored existence of hidden chambers or vaults sealed off from all but the highest echelons of the Vatican. Hierarchy. Legends persist of rooms within the archives containing texts so sensitive they are kept under lock and key, shielded not only by physical barriers but by ecclesiastical decree. These rumored holdings allegedly include apocryphal gospels, writings predating the canonical New Testament, and manuscripts that might challenge official church doctrine, including accounts of Jesus' formative years lost to mainstream history. Despite its name, the secret archives are not secret in the sense of being deliberately hidden, but rather private, a term dating from when the archives were solely accessible to the Pope and select advisors. Over the centuries, this exclusivity has created an aura of mystery, with the public and scholars alike imagining a treasure trove of forbidden knowledge concealed behind the stone walls. The archive's design also reflects the symbolic nature of its guardianship. It is a space where time itself is held hostage. Documents from the Middle Ages are preserved side by side with ancient Roman records, their chronological span illustrating the Church's role as both a conservator and a gatekeeper of history. The physical layout, the cold vaults, narrow aisles, and fortified entry points emphasizes control over knowledge, mirroring the institution's theological authority. In sum, the Vatican's secret archives are not merely a library, but a fortress of memory, where history's truths are curated with care, but also withheld with deliberation. The physical presence of the archive's vast, secure, and steeped in silence embodies the deeper mystery of what has been preserved, what has been lost, and what remains deliberately hidden from the eyes of the world. The Vatican's secret archives, while known as a vast repository of documents, are famously characterized by what remains off-limits rather than what has been openly shared. From its inception, the archive's custodians have exercised rigorous control over access to its holdings. This control extends not only to who may enter, but also which documents can be viewed, copied, or published. The result is an institutional gatekeeping of history, which has, over centuries, shaped the world's understanding of events, sometimes by omission as much as by revelation. Restrictions within the archives are multi-layered. At a basic level, permission to consult documents requires not just scholarly credentials, but often sponsorship by a recognized academic or ecclesiastical authority. Once granted entry, researchers face further limitations. Only specific collections or files are accessible, and requests for certain documents may be denied without explanation. The Vatican asserts these measures protect the fragile materials and maintain respect for the privacy of individuals or nations mentioned in the records. Yet skeptics argue that some restrictions serve to conceal more than preserve. Certain periods of history, particularly those surrounding contentious theological or political shifts, are notoriously guarded. For example, documents pertaining to the Inquisition, the papacy's diplomatic correspondence during major historical upheavals, or texts related to early Christianity are often tightly controlled or embargoed. This selectivity raises questions. Are some narratives being curated to uphold official church doctrine or protect institutional reputations? Perhaps most intriguing are the rumored archives related to the so-called lost years of Jesus, roughly the decade between his childhood and the start of his public ministry. Scholars outside the Vatican speculate that documents or texts touching on these years exist but are sealed due to their potential to disrupt established biblical timelines and dogma. This has given rise to theories about suppressed manuscripts, censored gospels, and alternative histories locked away behind layers of bureaucracy and ecclesiastical decree. Historically, the Vatican has been accused of censorship and suppression. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, though officially abolished in 1966, exemplified centuries of efforts to control religious discourse. Similarly, entire libraries were sometimes confiscated or reorganized under papal authority to remove heretical or inconvenient texts. The archives, as the ultimate repository, serve as both the guardian and arbiter of such knowledge, even in modern times. The slow pace of releasing documents fuels suspicions. Unlike many national archives that gradually declassify records, the Vatican maintains a conservative approach. For instance, the papal secret archives related to recent popes or 20th century events are released on a strict schedule, often decades after the fact, and not all materials become public. This measured transparency is viewed by some historians as a deliberate strategy to control the narrative of church history. The very concept of secrecy invites speculation about what is being withheld and why. Are there documents that might reveal the Church's role in shaping political history in ways contrary to popular belief? Are there texts that challenge the historical accuracy of canonical scriptures or reveal alternative accounts of Jesus' life? The uncertainty surrounding these questions sustains the archive's aura of mystery. Yet, It is important to acknowledge the difficulty of managing such an immense collection. Many documents are fragile, written in ancient languages, or poorly catalogued, which naturally complicates access. The Vatican's insistence on protecting its heritage must be balanced with the scholarly imperative for open inquiry. In conclusion, the restricted nature of the Vatican's secret archives transforms it into a paradox, a vast storehouse of human history and faith, yet simultaneously a vault of silences. What is withheld is as telling as what is displayed, and in those silences, the greatest mysteries, like the lost years of Jesus, continue to fuel both faith and speculation. Few outsiders have ever set foot inside the Vatican's secret archives, and among those who have been granted access, only a select few have shared glimpses of their experiences. These rare scholars, often cloaked in anonymity or cautious discretion, provide tantalizing anecdotes, windows into a world where history's most closely guarded secrets dwell in silence. One common thread in their testimonies is the overwhelming sense of awe mingled with palpable tension. Dr. Maria Conti, a medieval historian granted limited access in the early 2000s, described entering the archives as stepping into a timeless cathedral of knowledge, where every scroll and codex seemed to hum with unspoken stories. Yet she also noted the almost suffocating atmosphere, a reminder that the archives are as much a fortress as they are a library. You are acutely aware that you are handling not just fragile documents, but fragments of power, she said in a rare interview. Many scholars recount how access is granted only to specific sections, often after months or even years of petitioning. Father Thomas Rinaldi, a Vatican archivist himself, once remarked privately to a visiting researcher that entire wings of the archives are off limits, except to a handful of Vatican insiders. There are rooms behind rooms, he said, where the Church keeps manuscripts that, if ever revealed, would rewrite not only ecclesiastical history but the story of civilization itself. Several researchers have shared stories of encountering documents that contradict established narratives. Dr. Ian Mitchell, a biblical scholar, spoke of a fragile parchment he studied that contained references to events during Jesus' formative years, events absent from canonical texts and not mentioned in mainstream history. It was like discovering a missing chapter, Mitchell revealed, but I was warned to treat the material with extreme caution and discretion. Other scholars report the heavy presence of security measures, silent guards, surveillance cameras, and restricted reading hours. One visiting historian recounted being watched closely while consulting manuscripts related to early Christian sects and heretical movements, suggesting that the Vatican remains vigilant even in the present day to ensure certain information never slips beyond its control. The scholars also mentioned the peculiar absence of photocopying or photography privileges, forcing them to rely on handwritten notes made under strict supervision. This means that much of the knowledge remains confined to memory and private study, limiting wider academic discussion. Some scholars who have worked with forbidden or controversial texts describe an inner conflicted tension between reverence for the Church's custodianship and frustration at the limitations imposed on academic freedom. Dr. Elena Busquets, an expert in apocryphal Gospels, confessed that, although the archive's custodians were often courteous, the shadow of censorship loomed large. You sense that some knowledge is intentionally veiled, she said, not for preservation, but for suppression. Notably, a few scholars have mysteriously disappeared or suffered professional setbacks after delving too deeply into sensitive material. Rumors circulate about careers derailed, grant funding withdrawn, or worse, silent pressures to abandon controversial lines of inquiry. While concrete evidence is scarce, these patterns feed into the enduring mystique surrounding the archives and their hidden contents. Even among permitted scholars, there is a tacit understanding that discussing certain discoveries openly can have serious consequences. The Vatican's power extends beyond the archives themselves. Its influence within global religious, political, and academic institutions ensures that some topics remain taboo. Yet, despite these challenges, a small community of researchers continues to push boundaries, piecing together fragments of suppressed history from the scant clues they glean inside the archives. Their work, often published under pseudonyms or guarded with secrecy, fuels ongoing debates about what truths remain locked away and why. In the end, the anecdotes from these rare permitted scholars paint a picture of the Vatican's secret archives as a paradox, a sanctuary for priceless historical treasures, but also a bastion of secrecy where knowledge is carefully rationed. Behind the marble walls and iron gates lies a silent narrative, one shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed, and within that silence, the lost years of Jesus linger as one of history's most enduring mysteries, waiting to be uncovered. Throughout history, there have been persistent whispers and accounts of manuscripts, texts, and records that have simply vanished, documents that once existed but were lost, hidden, or destroyed under mysterious circumstances. Within the context of the Vatican's secret archives, these stories take on an even darker hue. Such disappearances suggest a deliberate and systematic effort to erase certain narratives from history. One of the most famous tales involves the sudden disappearance of early Christian Gospels and writings that did not conform to Orthodox doctrine. The Gnostic Gospels, for example, many of which were thought lost until the Nag Hammadi Library discovery in 1945, are believed by some historians to have been deliberately removed or suppressed by church authorities. While not all these texts were housed in the Vatican, the institution's central role in curating Christian history has linked it to efforts that led to their near erasure from public knowledge. There are also reports of private collections and smaller monastic libraries whose contents mysteriously ceased to be accounted for. Monks and scholars who safeguarded ancient manuscripts occasionally reported suspicious raids or reorganizations, after which priceless documents were never seen again. Such accounts imply an organized campaign to consolidate and control knowledge, rather than merely preserve it. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these disappearances is the fate of scholars and archivists themselves. Over the centuries, several individuals who questioned the official church history or sought to reveal hidden texts reportedly faced censorship, exile, or worse. Some manuscripts are said to have disappeared following their examination by controversial figures, fueling conspiracy theories that these works were intentionally removed to protect certain church secrets. The mysterious chronicles of the lost years, rumored to document Jesus' activities during his missing decade, are among the most elusive. References to such texts appear in obscure writings and anecdotal testimonies, but have never been publicly verified or disclosed by the Vatican. This has led many to speculate that these manuscripts were quietly removed or locked away, their existence denied to the wider world. Historians have also noted inconsistencies in archival records themselves, gaps, missing catalogues, or sudden breaks in the documentation of important periods. Such anomalies point to potential purges or censorship, where inconvenient truths may have been excised from the official record. In the digital age, concerns remain. Although digitization efforts promise greater transparency, Some fear that digital archives may be curated just as selectively, with sensitive materials omitted or encrypted beyond reach. Ultimately, these stories of disappearance leave more questions than answers. What texts have been lost, and why? Who decides which histories are preserved and which vanish? In the shadowy realm of the Vatican's secret archives, the disappearance of manuscripts is not merely about missing documents, it is about the erasure of potential truths and the shaping of history itself. Among the countless volumes housed within the Vatican's secret archives, whispers persist of manuscripts that specifically touch upon the mysterious lost years of Jesus, those formative decades between his childhood and the beginning of his public ministry, which remain unaccounted for in the canonical texts. These suspected texts are said to contain insights, events, and teachings that could radically alter our understanding of Jesus' life and spiritual journey, though the Vatican has never publicly acknowledged the existence of such documents. Occasional hints and references emerge from secondary sources, scholars, clergy, and whistleblowers who claim to have come across mentions or fragments of these elusive writings. Some describe them as ancient diaries or personal accounts, others as esoteric teachings exchanged with mystics, monks, or foreign sages during Jesus' alleged travels. One recurring theme in these mentions is the idea that Jesus' lost years were spent studying in distant lands, India, Egypt, or among the Essenes, learning wisdom beyond the reach of early Judean society. Supposed texts reportedly document these journeys and experiences, shedding light on practices and philosophies that later influenced his teachings. Certain apocryphal gospels and writings, such as the infancy Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of the Hebrews, offer tantalizing glimpses into these years, but are often dismissed by mainstream scholarship as later fabrications. However, some researchers argue that these texts may have origins tied to now hidden, authentic records preserved within the Vatican archives. In addition, some Vatican insiders have allegedly alluded to restricted sections of the archives containing scrolls and codices written in obscure languages or coded script texts whose contents have yet to be fully deciphered or released. These are believed to hold clues about the lost years and the early development of Christian doctrine that deviated from accepted narratives. The secrecy surrounding these suspected texts feeds speculation about what truths the Church might have chosen to withhold, fearing the destabilizing effects on theology and ecclesiastical authority. The question remains, if these manuscripts exist, what revelations do they contain, and why are they still kept under lock and key? As the quest to uncover the truth continues, the very idea of these lost documents challenges us to reconsider the boundaries of history and faith and invites us to imagine the untold story behind one of the world's most enigmatic figures. The Gospel of Thomas stands as one of the most intriguing and controversial texts linked to early Christianity, an ancient collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that was excluded from the canonical Bible and labeled heretical by the early Church. This text offers a radically different perspective on Jesus' teachings and hints at knowledge that might have been deliberately suppressed, fueling questions about what the Vatican chose to erase or hide. Discovered in 1945 among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in Egypt, the Gospel of Thomas is not a narrative gospel like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Instead, it is a compilation of 114 sayings, some cryptic, some mystical, purportedly spoken by Jesus himself. Many of these sayings emphasize direct, personal, spiritual knowledge, gnosis over ritual or dogma, suggesting an inner path to divine truth accessible to all seekers. What makes the Gospel of Thomas especially provocative is that several of its sayings parallel those found in the canonical Gospels, but with significant differences in tone and meaning. For instance, where the New Testament often focuses on Jesus' role as the Messiah and the coming of the kingdom of God, Thomas emphasizes self-realization, enlightenment, and understanding the hidden nature of the divine within. Early church authorities viewed such teachings with suspicion. The emphasis on personal gnosis and rejection of institutionalized doctrine conflicted with the growing orthodoxy of the Church, which sought to unify Christian beliefs and practices under a centralized authority. Consequently, the Gospel of Thomas was condemned as heretical and excluded from the biblical canon during the 4th century, a decision heavily influenced by church councils such as Nicaea. This exclusion was no accident. The Church's campaign against so-called Gnostic texts was part of a broader effort to control religious knowledge and define the correct interpretation of Jesus' life and message. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on hidden wisdom and direct spiritual experience, posed a threat to the hierarchical structure of the Church. Moreover, some scholars argue that the Gospel of Thomas preserves echoes of teachings from Jesus' lost years, those mysterious decades omitted from the canonical narrative. Its cryptic sayings suggest influences from Eastern mysticism, esoteric traditions, and secret knowledge that might have been transmitted during Jesus' unrecorded travels. The text's rediscovery ignited intense scholarly debate and popular fascination, challenging long-held assumptions about early Christianity. While mainstream theology remains cautious, the Gospel of Thomas has inspired modern spiritual seekers and researchers who view it as a key to understanding a more complex and nuanced Jesus. Yet, despite its importance, the Gospel of Thomas remains largely marginalized, often relegated to the status of an obscure curiosity rather than a legitimate window into early Christian thought. Its suppression, alongside other banned Gospels, illustrates the profound struggle over religious truth and memory. In essence, the Gospel of Thomas embodies the tension between official history and forbidden knowledge, the battle between institutional control and individual spiritual awakening. It invites us to reconsider what might have been lost in the shadows of church dogma, and what secret wisdom the Vatican may have sought to keep hidden for centuries. Among the many banned or lost Gospels attributed to early Christian sects, the Gospel of the Essenes occupies a particularly enigmatic place. Unlike the well-known canonical texts, this Gospel is believed to have originated from the Essene community, a Jewish sect that flourished during the Second Temple period and is often associated with ascetic practices, communal living, and deep spiritual teachings. The Essenes are famously linked to the Dead Sea Scrolls, whose discovery in the mid-20th century unveiled a trove of religious writings once thought lost. The Gospel of the Essenes, though less widely known than the Gospel of Thomas or Mary Magdalene, is reputed to contain teachings that shed light on a form of early Christianity that diverged significantly from what later became Orthodox doctrine. This text reportedly presents Jesus not just as a Messiah, but as a spiritual aspirant and initiate into the mystical wisdom of the Essenes, emphasizing purification, self-discipline, and preparation for a higher spiritual calling. Historical records and some early church fathers mention the Essenes with mixed views, often labeling them as separatists or heretics. This ambivalence possibly contributed to the erasure or suppression of their writings and influence. Yet, the Essenes' practices bear striking similarities to the lifestyle. Jesus and his earliest followers are believed to have adopted communal meals, ritual cleansing, and prophetic expectation. The Gospel of the Essenes is thought to reveal a version of Jesus that is more human and accessible, a seeker of wisdom who spent his lost years among these mystics, absorbing their teachings and rituals. This contrasts sharply with the later emphasis on divinity and miracle working, prevalent in mainstream Christianity. What makes this gospel particularly significant is how it bridges the gap between Jewish mysticism and emerging Christian thought. It presents Jesus as a teacher deeply rooted in Jewish esoteric traditions, thereby highlighting a spiritual lineage often downplayed or obscured in official histories. However, due to its heretical label, the Gospel of the Essenes was largely excluded from early Christian literature. The Vatican, in its effort to consolidate doctrinal control, purportedly confiscated or destroyed many such texts that did not align with Orthodox views. The loss of this gospel contributes to the broader narrative of selective preservation and censorship. Modern interest in the Gospel of the Essenes has grown alongside renewed scholarly focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish-Christian relations. Some researchers suggest that rediscovering and studying this gospel could provide valuable insight into the formative years of Christianity and the mysterious decades of Jesus' life not covered by the canonical Gospels. Ultimately, the Gospel of the Essenes embodies a hidden chapter of spiritual history, one where ancient wisdom, mysticism, and the human quest for divine understanding intersect. Its suppression highlights how the control of religious narratives has shaped the story of Jesus, leaving many questions unanswered about his true teachings and experiences during the lost years. Among the many texts omitted from the New Testament, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene stands out not only for its rarity, but for the radical shift it proposes in understanding Jesus' closest circle and the nature of his teachings. Discovered in the late 19th century and translated from Coptic manuscripts found in the Nag Hammadi library, this gospel offers a voice long silenced, a voice that challenges the patriarchal narrative shaped by the early church. Unlike the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene is portrayed not just as a devoted follower, but as a key disciple and spiritual leader. The text depicts Mary as someone who received special teachings directly from Jesus' teachings of inner knowledge, transcendence, and spiritual awakening that were kept hidden from most others, especially male apostles. This portrayal disrupts the conventional hierarchy and suggests that women held important roles in the earliest Christian communities. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene also delves into complex themes of the soul's journey, the struggle against ignorance, and the path to true enlightenment. Jesus' teachings in this Gospel emphasize the importance of personal experience over blind faith, urging followers to seek divine knowledge from within rather than relying solely on external authority. This mystical approach aligns closely with Gnostic traditions, which the early church condemned and suppressed. The reasons for the Gospel's exclusion from the biblical canon are closely tied to the church's desire to maintain doctrinal uniformity and patriarchal control. Mary Magdalene's prominent role and the Gospel's emphasis on secret knowledge threatened to undermine the male-dominated ecclesiastical hierarchy that was consolidating power during the formative centuries of Christianity. Moreover, this Gospel hints at a more intimate and complex relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, suggesting she was not just a follower but a trusted confidant and spiritual companion. Such interpretations challenge centuries of Orthodox teaching that sought to minimize or demonize her role, reducing her to a repentant sinner rather than a leader. The suppression of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene thus represents a broader effort to erase alternative voices and spiritual perspectives that did not conform to the official narrative. It highlights how much of early Christian history and theology was shaped not simply by spiritual concerns, but by power dynamics and political considerations today. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene inspires scholars and spiritual seekers alike to reconsider the foundations of Christianity. It invites questions about the lost years of Jesus, years during which teachings, such as those found in this Gospel, may have been formed and passed on, only to be hidden or destroyed by those intent on controlling the faith's direction. In the shadow of this forbidden text, the true diversity of early Christian thought remains tantalizingly out of reach, urging us to explore beyond official histories and remain open to the possibility that the story of Jesus and his closest followers, far richer and more complex than we have been told. Among the many mysterious and controversial texts linked to early Christianity, the Acts of Pilate, sometimes known as the Gospel of Nicodemus, occupies a unique place. Unlike the canonical Gospels, this apocryphal text centers on Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor responsible for the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. Yet beyond that, it contains narratives and details that do not appear in the official biblical accounts, including claims about Jesus' activities, resurrection, and the nature of his kingship. The Acts of Pilate purports to be an official report or record, submitted by Pilate himself to the Roman emperor. It paints a picture of Pilate as a reluctant participant in the crucifixion, somewhat sympathetic to Jesus, caught between political pressures and personal doubt. This narrative challenges the black and white portrayal common in traditional Christian teaching, where Pilate is often either a mere bureaucrat or a villain. More intriguingly, the text includes accounts of Jesus' descent into the underworld after his death, a harrowing journey to liberate the souls of the righteous who had died before his coming. This harrowing of hell scene, absent from the canonical Gospels, but echoed in some Christian traditions, suggests a broader cosmic mission for Jesus that goes beyond earthly ministry. The Acts of Pilate also contains material about the resurrection, witnesses and events surrounding Jesus' post-crucifixion appearances, with some variations that diverge from the canonical Gospels. This variation reflects the diversity of early Christian beliefs and narratives, many of which were ultimately deemed heretical or too contradictory by the institutional church. Why was the Acts of Pilate excluded from the official canon and often suppressed? One reason lies in its complex theological implications and political sensitivities. By portraying Pilate in a more nuanced light and emphasizing Jesus' victory over the underworld, it disrupted the straightforward narrative of suffering, death, and resurrection that the early church sought to promote as orthodox doctrine. Moreover, the text was associated with groups labeled heretical, such as Gnostic sects, and was viewed as a challenge to church authority. Its vivid descriptions and alternative perspectives on Jesus' mission made it dangerous for those controlling the church's official history. As with many banned Gospels, the Acts of Pilate was often hidden, censored, or destroyed, limiting its circulation to secretive groups or underground networks. This suppression contributed to the broader erasure of narratives that might have offered a richer, more multifaceted view of Jesus' life and significance. Today, fragments of the Acts of Pilate survive in various languages, intriguing historians and theologians who seek to piece together the lost diversity of early Christian thought. Its preservation outside official channels serves as a reminder that what we know about Jesus has been shaped not just by spiritual revelation, but by power, struggles over history, memory, and belief. In the centuries following the death of Jesus, the early Christian world was anything but unified. Far from the clean, singular narrative the later church would promote. Early Christianity was a chaotic landscape of diverse sects, doctrines, and beliefs about who Jesus truly was, what his message meant, and how his followers should live. Many of these groups held views that today would seem shockingly unorthodox for that very reason. The early institutional church sought to suppress them, branding them as heretics and erasing their teachings from history. One of the earliest and most enigmatic groups were the Ebionites. These Jewish Christians rejected the idea of Jesus as divine, believing instead that he was a mortal man chosen by God for a prophetic mission. They held to the Jewish law and rejected Paul of Tarsus, viewing his teachings as a corruption of Jesus' original message. The Ebionites' version of the gospel included details about Jesus' early life and teachings omitted by the canonical texts. Their persistence threatened the church's growing authority, and by the 4th century, they had been all but wiped out or absorbed into more orthodox sects. Another influential movement was Gnosticism, a broad and complex spiritual philosophy that emphasized hidden knowledge, gnosis, as the key to salvation. Gnostics believed that the material world was created by a lesser, flawed deity, and that Jesus came to impart secret wisdom, allowing souls to transcend the physical plane. Dozens of Gnostic texts once circulated alongside the canonical Gospels, offering alternative accounts of Jesus' origins, teachings, and relationships, including his connection to figures like Mary Magdalene. To the early church fathers, Gnosticism posed a dire threat, for it undermined the authority of the church by suggesting that sacred knowledge was personal, mystical, and not confined to institutional control. The Marcionites, followers of the Theologian Marcion, rejected the Old Testament entirely, arguing that the vengeful God depicted there could not be the same as the loving Father, spoken of by Jesus. Marcion created his own canon of Scripture, which notably excluded the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, keeping only a modified version of Luke and several Pauline letters. Though his movement gained traction across the Mediterranean, it too was denounced as heresy, and its texts systematically destroyed. There were also the Montanists, a prophetic sect that believed the Holy Spirit continued to speak directly through living prophets, offering new revelations that sometimes contradicted earlier teachings. Their ecstatic, visionary practices and the central role of female prophets alarmed church leaders, who declared them heretical and exiled their followers. The suppression of these sects was not solely about theological disputes. Each group represented a competing narrative about Jesus' identity, mission, and teachings, narratives that often included accounts of the so-called lost years or suggested Jesus' association with secret mystical orders and travels to distant lands, to cement a singular, controllable version of Christian history. The early church fathers convened councils, issued decrees, and launched campaigns to erase these dissenting voices. Many of the writings from these sects were burned or banned, their followers exiled or executed. Some of their gospels were buried in deserts, sealed in jars, and hidden within caves, surviving only by the slimmest of chances, like the Nag Hammadi library discovered in Egypt in 1945. What remains today of these early Christian sects is fragmentary, a tantalizing glimpse into a far richer and more diverse spiritual world than what the official record suggests. And perhaps most tellingly, their persistent erasure highlights a pattern that power, when threatened by alternate truths, will seek not merely to refute but to obliterate them entirely. The history of Christian theology is marked not only by revelation, but by repression. Across the centuries, thinkers, mystics, and scholars who dared to probe too deeply into the murky gaps of Jesus' life, particularly the so-called lost years, themselves at odds with the custodians of orthodoxy. For the institutional church, speculation about what Jesus may have said, done, or learned beyond the narrow confines of the canonical Gospels was not merely academic curiosity, it was a threat to doctrinal control. One of the earliest figures to face ecclesiastical wrath was Origen of Alexandria c. 184 to 253 CE, a theologian of staggering intellect whose speculative writings ventured into dangerous territory. Origen posited that Jesus, like other great philosophers, may have traveled widely in his youth to gather wisdom from sages of other lands. Though revered for much of his life after his death, later church councils declared parts of his teachings heretical. Several of his texts were banned, and others subtly redacted to remove offending material. Centuries later, the 9th-century Irish monk de Quille stirred controversy by documenting ancient accounts of Christian travelers to lands as distant as Egypt and India, speculating that holy men including possibly Jesus might have walked these same paths. While de Quille himself avoided execution, his writings were quietly suppressed, confined to isolated monasteries, and later dismissed by Vatican scholars in the Middle Ages. The Spanish scholar Michael Servetus emerged as a bold voice questioning the rigid orthodoxy of Christ's earthly life. Servetus argued that many details about Jesus' early years had been deliberately obscured by church authorities, hinting that the so-called lost years held transformative truths about Christ's human and mystical development. His broader challenges to Trinitarian doctrine made him a marked man. In 1553, under orders from John Calvin and with approval from the Catholic Church, Servetus was burned at the stake. His books, many of which hinted at alternative gospel traditions, were incinerated with him. Giordano Bruno, a 16th philosopher and former Dominican friar, is remembered primarily for his cosmological theories, but he also ventured into theological speculation. Bruno suggested that Jesus had absorbed esoteric wisdom from ancient Egyptian and Persian mystics during his youth, a claim that incensed church authorities. His broader defiance of church dogma led to his arrest by the Roman Inquisition, after 7 years of imprisonment and torture. Bruno was executed in 1600 in Rome's Campo dei Fiori. His ashes, like those of so many banned texts, scattered to the winds. Even into the modern era, the risk of exploring the lost years remained real. In the late 19th century, Nicholas Notovich, a Russian historian, claimed to have discovered ancient Tibetan scrolls describing a young Jesus known as Isahu, had lived and taught in India. While Notovich was not executed, the fierce campaign of discreditation waged against him by European religious institutions effectively ruined his career. His book was banned in several Catholic countries, and future scholars who sought to verify his claims were denied access to key archives. These stories illustrate a pattern of intellectual repression, stretching from antiquity to the modern age. Across cultures and centuries, those who challenged the official narrative of Jesus' life dared to suggest that what was absent from the record might be as consequential as what remained faced censorship, exile, or death. The Church's determination to maintain doctrinal purity came at a tremendous human and cultural cost, erasing not only texts, but the courageous individuals who championed them. And still, despite every attempt to silence them, fragments of their ideas, legends, and lost manuscripts continue to resurface, stubbornly refusing to be forgotten. History, for all its claim to objectivity, has always been a contested space, a battlefield where narratives collide, merge, and sometimes vanish altogether. At its heart lies a single, unsettling question: who gets to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten throughout the rise and fall of civilizations? Those who wield power have instinctively recognized that controlling the collective memory of a people is as potent a weapon as any sword or army, from ancient empires to medieval. Kingdoms, regimes understood that the past could be shaped to legitimize the present. Monuments were toppled, names were stricken from records, and inconvenient truths quietly buried beneath layers of sanctioned history. Memory, far from being an impartial archive of facts, was molded by those who stood to gain most from its curation. And nowhere was this more evident than in the early Christian church's handling of its own sacred narrative, the Vatican, and before it, the powerful councils of early Christianity, became not only the guardians of spiritual doctrine, but the custodians of historical memory. They determined which gospels were holy and which were heretical, which philosophers deserved reverence and which merited flames. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, did more than define Christ's divinity. It delineated what could be remembered and what must be forgotten. Every council decision was a razor, slicing away inconvenient complexities from the historical record. But the Catholic Church was hardly alone in this practice. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs would chisel out the names of disgraced rulers from temple walls, effectively erasing them from public memory. The Roman Empire famously declared damnatio memoria, condemning certain figures to oblivion by removing their images and inscriptions from public life. This manipulation of collective remembrance allowed ruling powers to retroactively reshape history, ensuring that future generations inherited a curated version of the past, one tailored to maintain loyalty, suppress dissent, and legitimize authority. In many ways, control over memory became the ultimate instrument of control over identity itself. To forget a people's stories, heroes, and sacred wisdom was to sever their connection to their roots. And to dictate which narratives survived meant to dictate how future generations would understand themselves, their origins, and the forces that shaped their world. Even today, modern institutions, governments, and media continue this ancient tradition, deciding which histories deserve public commemoration and which remain buried in obscure archives or outright denial. The mechanisms have evolved, but the impulse remains eerily unchanged. As we reflect on the lost years of Jesus, those enigmatic chapters, stripped from public memory, we're reminded that what we call history is rarely a perfect reflection of reality. It is, more often than not, a mirror polished by the hands of the powerful, leaving us to peer at the fragments they've chosen to preserve while wondering what vital truths might still lie hidden in the shadowed corners of our forgotten past. Throughout history, overt suppression of information has often drawn the ire of the public, inspiring resistance, rebellion, and, at times, martyrdom. Burning books, imprisoning dissidents, and branding heretical thinkers were bold, unmistakable acts of control that left visible scars on the historical record. But what proves far more dangerous and far more insidious is the quiet, unchallenged silence that falls over forbidden knowledge. Silence is a subtler weapon. It doesn't burn texts or shatter statues. It simply allows ideas to wither through neglect, fading from memory as if they were never there. Silence operates in the unseen margins of history. It is not the dramatic act of censorship, but the omission of certain stories from official chronicles, the quiet removal of teachings from sacred doctrine, and the unnoticed absence of names from the pages of historical texts. What makes silence so perilous is its invisibility. Whereas suppression leaves evidence, the charred remains of burned books or records of heresy trials, silence leaves nothing to protest against. The void becomes the new norm, and over time, few remember there was ever anything missing in the case of Christianity's lost years of Jesus. The danger of silence lies not only in what was taken away, but in the generations that grew up never knowing they had been deprived. When a story is suppressed, its absence can be identified, debated, and potentially recovered. But when it is quietly omitted, when entire chapters of history are never told, people cease to ask questions. Whole civilizations can grow up, blind to their own past, inheriting a version of truth meticulously edited by long-departed hands. This kind of silence fosters a collective amnesia. It breaks the chain of inquiry that fuels intellectual and spiritual growth. Without access to the breadth of human experience, to every fragment of wisdom, even the unsettling ones, societies risk stagnation. The gaps in memory aren't merely academic. They shape morality, culture, and identity. They determine what is considered possible or permissible, and they silently enforce boundaries around what humanity is allowed to imagine for itself. Moreover, silence can masquerade as truth. In the absence of alternative narratives, the officially sanctioned story becomes uncontested fact. Over time, people come to believe not because evidence supports it, but because it is the only story they have ever been told. The danger here is profound. History stops being a dialogue between the past and present and becomes a monologue dictated by those who understood that sometimes the easiest way to control a people is not to lie to them, but simply to omit. In this way, the lost years of Jesus serve as more than a historical mystery. They are a cautionary tale about the quiet power of silence and the urgent need to question what we've been told, what we haven't, and why certain truths remain forever just out of reach. History, at its heart, is a story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. It is a narrative woven from victories and tragedies, wisdom and mistakes, triumphs and betrayals. But rarely is this story complete. Every civilization, whether ancient or modern, practices a form of selective memory. Certain events are emphasized, others are softened, and many are simply discarded. Over generations, these choices do more than shape public memory. They forge the identity of entire cultures, defining what is deemed noble, shameful, sacred, or taboo. Selective memory is not always an intentional act of deception. Often it begins as a way to preserve a sense of unity, to shield a community from traumatic or destabilizing truths. Myths are polished, heroes are idealized, and inconvenient facts quietly recede into obscurity. Over time, these omissions become structural, embedded in national histories, religious canons, and cultural rituals. The stories a civilization chooses to remember, and those it chooses to forget, ultimately dictate how it understands itself and interacts with the world. Consider the example of the Roman Empire. While its grandeur, engineering marvels, and military prowess are celebrated, its darker practices, such as cultural erasure, systemic slavery, and the brutal suppression of dissent, are often relegated to footnotes in mainstream historical accounts. The Roman legacy of law and architecture is rightly acknowledged, but the memory of peoples and beliefs they extinguished is largely absent from the popular imagination. In doing so, a distorted image of progress is preserved, divorced from the costs that built it. The Christian world, too, offers a stark example in the handling of early religious diversity, by canonizing certain texts and condemning others early. Church leaders shaped not only the doctrine of Christianity, but the moral framework of Western civilization. The Gospels we know were selected from a larger, richer tradition of writings, many of which suggested alternate visions of faith, the nature of the divine, and humanity's relationship to the cosmos. The suppression of these voices didn't merely narrow theological debate, it narrowed the scope of what future generations could believe about themselves and their place in existence. Selective memory also influences modern societies. Nations frame their histories around pivotal victories, foundational myths, and moral high grounds, often omitting atrocities, betrayals, or failures that complicate the preferred narrative. This shapes not only public consciousness, but policy-making, international relations, and social values. The lessons unlearned from forgotten pasts are destined to be repeated. In the case of the lost years of Jesus, the selective omission of this chapter left an indelible mark on religious, cultural, and philosophical history. It removed from the public record possible insights into spiritual traditions, intercultural dialogues, and forgotten wisdoms, and, in its absence, a rigid, controlled version of faith emerged, one shaped less by open inquiry than by the careful curation of memory. In the end, what a civilization forgets often defines it as powerfully as what it remembers. If history has one unchanging tendency, it is the systematic erasure of inconvenient knowledge. Across empires, faiths, and ages, those in power have sought to control not only what people believe, but what they are allowed to remember. This pattern of destroying, suppressing, or reinterpreting the past is as old as civilization itself, and it happens so predictably, so universally, that it seems almost a reflex of authority. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs regularly defaced monuments and inscriptions of their predecessors, erasing names and achievements from stone so completely it was as if those rulers had never existed. The famous case of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful and groundbreaking rulers, illustrates this well. After her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, ordered her images and titles chiseled out from temples and statues, attempting to obliterate her from memory and rewrite the royal lineage as if she had never reigned. For centuries, her story vanished into silence. Rome, too, was a master of damnatio memoria, the formal condemnation of a person's memory. When an emperor fell out of favor, his statues were toppled, his name removed from public records, and his decrees voided. Citizens were forbidden from speaking his name. In time, it was as though he had never lived. This practice didn't merely punish the dead. It controlled the living by demonstrating that the state could dictate what was remembered and what was forgotten in the religious sphere. The early Christian Church set a similar precedent. As competing sects and interpretations of Christ's teachings emerged, councils convened to decree which beliefs were orthodox and which were heresy. Entire libraries of alternative gospels, mystical texts, and divergent philosophies were burned, their followers exiled, executed, or silenced. From the Gospel of Mary Magdalene to the Gospel of the Ebionites, countless works were lost not by accident but by deliberate design. The Middle Ages witnessed the burning of libraries in Constantinople, Baghdad, and Alexandria, each eradicating precious records of ancient science, philosophy, and culture. The motives varied: religious zealotry, political conquest, or fear of dissent, but the effect was the same: the disappearance of knowledge that threatened prevailing power structures. Even in the modern era, history repeats itself. Authoritarian regimes have purged archives, censored literature, and erased inconvenient witnesses from official photographs. From Stalinist Russia to 20th century China, state apparatuses have meticulously curated national memory, reshaping the collective past to justify the present. This recurring pattern teaches us something profound about human governance: that information, more than armies or wealth, is the ultimate currency of control. And by managing what societies remember and what they are taught to forget, those in power can quietly shape the destiny of entire civilizations. The story of Jesus' lost years, perhaps buried within secret vaults or forgotten scrolls, may be just another chapter in this long, unbroken history of erasure. But history, even when hidden, leaves traces, and the persistent pattern of suppression only deepens the world's longing to recover what was lost. Though the early centuries of Christianity saw the systematic suppression of alternative accounts of Jesus' life, the modern world, with its age of exploration, expanding literacy, and rising secular inquiry, rekindled curiosity about the lost. Years, from the 19th century onward, a small but determined stream of scholars, mystics, and adventurers dared to ask what had happened during those mysterious years between Jesus' childhood and his ministry. Their questions, while often met with resistance, inspired a new wave of investigation into one of history's most enduring enigmas. The mid-19th century marked a notable turning point. In 1894, Russian traveler and writer Nicholas Notovich published The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, claiming he had discovered ancient scrolls in a Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, India. These scrolls allegedly chronicled the travels of a man named Issa, a sage from the West, whose teachings and crucifixion bore striking resemblance to those of Jesus. Notovich's sensational story captured the imagination of readers, but was swiftly denounced by the Church and many Western scholars, dismissed as either fabrication or heresy in the decades that followed. Other explorers and spiritual seekers continued this search. Swami Abhedananda, a respected Indian philosopher, retraced Notovich's steps in the early 20th century and claimed to have verified the existence of similar scrolls. British and French mystics traveling through Tibet and Kashmir reported rumors of a Western teacher enshrined in oral histories and temple records. Though these accounts were largely anecdotal and lacked official corroboration, they kept the question alive in academic circles. Some theologians cautiously examined the possibility of undocumented years in Jesus' life. G.R.S. Mead, an early 20th century scholar of Gnostic texts and esoteric Christianity, argued that gaps in the canonical Gospels might conceal profound mysteries about Jesus, true teachings, and formative experiences. His writings were marginalized by mainstream theologians, but gained a quiet following among those intrigued by suppressed traditions. The rise of modern archaeology and the 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt brought fresh attention to alternative Christian scriptures long deemed heretical. Although none directly detailed Jesus' lost years, these texts hinted at a more complex and diverse early Christianity than the Vatican's official narrative acknowledged. Similar intrigue followed the 1947 discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which scholars speculated might contain oblique references to a messianic figure whose identity and actions had been deliberately obscured. In the 21st century, documentaries, books, and independent researchers have revisited these questions with the benefit of digital archives and global connectivity. Yet, institutional resistance persists. Major religious authorities, including the Vatican, continue to dismiss such inquiries as baseless speculation, preserving an official narrative that leaves little room for uncertainty. Still, the yearning to illuminate those missing years remains undiminished. Each generation finds its seekers, drawn by the enduring possibility that somewhere in a forgotten scroll, a weathered manuscript, or a whispered legend, the missing chapters of Jesus' life await rediscovery. As the 20th and 21st centuries unfolded, a number of bold historians, theologians, and mystics dared to challenge the accepted boundaries of Christian history, seeking to recover lost knowledge and question why certain accounts of Jesus' life had vanished from the official record. Many of these researchers operated on the fringes of academic and religious institutions, risking reputations and careers to pursue a fuller understanding of the man behind the theology. Their findings, though often marginalized, dismissed, or outright suppressed, have added compelling voices to the ongoing debate about the lost years. Among the notable figures was Dr. Holger Kirsten, a German theologian whose 1980s work, Jesus Lived in India, argued that evidence from ancient Indian texts, local Kashmiri traditions, and archaeological records pointed to Jesus' survival after the crucifixion and his later years spent in South Asia. Kirsten's thesis drew heavily upon Buddhist scriptures and Islamic accounts from Kashmir, where a tomb attributed to Uz Asaf, believed by some to be Jesus, still attracts curious visitors. Though his work was largely dismissed by mainstream scholars, it remains influential in alternative historical circles. Similarly, Theologin Elaine Pagels, a respected academic at Princeton University, illuminated the complex diversity of early Christian beliefs in her seminal work, The Gnostic Gospels. While her research did not directly address the lost years, it exposed how early church councils systematically eliminated texts and sects that contradicted the emerging orthodoxy. Pagels faced criticism from conservative religious groups, wary of her advocacy for a more inclusive, pluralistic view of early Christianity's history. Mystical thinkers like Paramahansa, Yogananda, and Edgar Cayce, though operating outside of formal academia, also contributed to this tradition of inquiry. Yogananda's writings on Jesus emphasized the compatibility between Christ's teachings and Eastern mysticism, suggesting ancient connections between early Christianity and Eastern wisdom traditions. Cayce, the famed American mystic, gave numerous readings in the early 20th century, claiming that Jesus had traveled and studied in Egypt, India, and Tibet during his youth, a claim derided by church authorities but eagerly followed by his adherents. More recently, Bajant Lee and Lincoln's controversial 1982 bestseller, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, proposed that not only were significant elements of Christian history concealed, but that clandestine organizations had safeguarded these suppressed truths for centuries. Their thesis was met with fierce opposition from the Vatican and Christian scholars, and though often categorized as speculative history, it rekindled popular interest in long-suppressed religious mysteries. Even today, scholars investigating the so-called apocryphal texts, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, and other non-canonical writings, encounter institutional reluctance. Requests to access certain Vatican manuscripts remain unanswered, and academic careers have quietly been stalled for those who suggest unorthodox theories about Jesus' undocumented years. In the shadows of official history, these suppressed findings and censored voices form a scattered but resilient lineage of seekers, each one drawn to the possibility that the true story of Jesus, including those mysterious binarious, missing years, lies just beyond the reach of sanctioned memory. Even in our hyper-connected, information-rich modern age, certain questions remain curiously untouched. The lost years of Jesus, so densely packed with intrigue and cultural significance, linger on the periphery of both religious scholarship and public discourse. Despite the vast archives of knowledge humanity has accumulated, we find ourselves hemmed in by a silent agreement, an invisible boundary between what is officially accepted and what must remain speculative. This silence is no accident. While modern scholars have reopened long-forgotten manuscripts and apocryphal texts, access remains limited. Requests to view particular Vatican-held documents are met with vague responses or indefinite delays. Certain Christian denominations actively discourage believers from exploring non-canonical material, branding such pursuits as dangerous to faith. Public conversations about the lost years are often dismissed as fringe curiosity, suitable for conspiracy theorists and mystics, but unworthy of serious academic or theological attention. Why is this so? Perhaps because these silences serve a purpose. To acknowledge gaps is to question the completeness of official narratives, and to admit the possibility of alternative accounts is to cede control over the meaning of one of history's most influential figures. In many ways, the mystery of Jesus' lost years is not merely about what happened, but about who gets to decide what counts as history. Every society constructs its identity around shared stories, and challenges to those stories, especially ones involving a figure as pivotal as Jesus, threaten to unsettle the foundations of belief, authority, and tradition, even outside religious institutions. This silence persists. Media outlets, academic conferences, and popular history series rarely address these mysteries without framing them as speculative entertainment rather than legitimate inquiry. It reveals an enduring discomfort with uncertainties that resist categorization, mysteries that refuse to be tidily solved. And so, these lost years are not just absent from history books, they remain missing from the cultural conversation. In that absence lies an irony. The more persistently these years are ignored, the more alluring they become. The question is no longer only what happened, but why we have chosen, generation after generation, not to ask more forcefully. It's a silence that speaks volumes, and one that invites us to listen. As we reach the end of this long, winding trail through suppressed manuscripts, ancient legends, and the forbidden margins of religious history, one unsettling thought persists. Why are we, in this era of inquiry, skepticism, and unprecedented access to information, still hesitant to ask the simplest of questions? Why do we so often deny ourselves, both individually and collectively, the right to wonder? It isn't just a matter of curiosity about where Jesus might have gone during those 18 undocumented years. At its core, this is about something far more universal: humanity's relationship with mystery. We've sent probes to the edge of the solar system, decoded the genome, and reconstructed ancient languages. And yet, when it comes to certain historical enigmas, particularly those bound to the sacred, two institutions of power, and two stories that anchor billions of lives, our sense of wonder is often met with quiet discouragement. Why is this? Perhaps because to wonder aloud about these matters invites discomfort. It threatens to loosen tightly woven narratives that have, for centuries, ordered societies, given solace, and maintained hierarchies. To ask about Jesus' lost years is, in effect, to question the completeness and reliability of the world's most foundational religious history, and such questions ripple outward, unsettling more than mere doctrine. They touch upon ideas of authority, faith, control, and our willingness to confront the unknown. But what if it is precisely in these unasked or half-asked questions that we reclaim something vital, not necessarily answers, but a deeper engagement with mystery itself? Wonder is not dangerous. Wonder is how civilizations rise, how art is born, how philosophy stirs, and how faith deepens. The suppression of wonder diminishes not only history, but our humanity. In the end, whether Jesus journeyed to India, studied in Egypt, or walked alongside the Essenes, may matter less than our willingness to ask. The lost years challenge us not merely as historians or believers, but as thinkers, to claim, without shame or fear, the enduring human right to wonder. And so the final question lingers: what else are we not allowing ourselves to ask?